There's a place in America that has marked itself for over 100 years as the land of lakes. It's on the license plates. It's in the tourism campaigns. It's in the school textbooks. The land of 10,000 lakes. And for most Americans, for most Minnesotans, that phrase has always just been true, settled, obvious. Except it isn't. Because there is another state, one that almost never comes up in this conversation, that doesn't have 10,000 lakes. It doesn't have 100,000 lakes. It has 3 million. 3 million lakes. And almost nobody talks about it. So today we're going to fix that. We're going to find out why Minnesota became famous for something it doesn't even lead in, and why Alaska, the most water-rich state in the entire country by a factor that is almost hard to believe, has somehow stayed completely out of the conversation. Let's start with the raw numbers, because they are genuinely staggering. Minnesota, the so-called land of 10,000 lakes, has approximately 11,842 lakes. If you use the standard definition, a body of water 10 acres or larger. If you lower the bar and include smaller ponds and wetlands, that number climbs to around 28,000. That is genuinely impressive. For the contiguous 48 states, Minnesota is the undisputed leader. But Alaska doesn't play by those rules. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game has counted 3,197 officially named natural lakes. But named lakes are almost beside the point. Because when you count every natural body of water greater than 5 acres, the unnamed ones, the remote ones, the ones no human being has ever stood beside, that number rises to somewhere between 3 million and 3.2 million lakes. To put that in perspective, if every single person in America, all 335 million of us, each personally owned 9 lakes, we still wouldn't have enough people to cover Alaska's lake count. Alaska also holds over 40% of the entire nation's surface water resources. It has more than 12,000 rivers. Its largest lake, Lake Liamna, covers 1,000 square miles and is the second largest freshwater lake in the entire United States, behind only Lake Superior. And yet, ask the average American which state has the most lakes. They will almost certainly say Minnesota. So how did this happen? The story of how Minnesota became the land of 10,000 lakes is, at its core, a story about marketing, and it's a surprisingly good one. It starts in 1874 at the Minnesota State Fair, where a professor named Ransom Humiston gave a speech in which he referred to Minnesota as a place with, quote, over 10,000 lakes. It was an offhand observation, a rhetorical flourish, not a census, not a survey. By the late 1800s, local newspapers and tourism boosters had picked it up. By the early 1900s, an organization called the 10,000 Lakes of Minnesota Association was actively promoting the state using that exact slogan. They put it on brochures. They sent it to travel magazines. They repeated it so consistently and so loudly that it stopped being a marketing claim and started being received wisdom. In 1950, the Minnesota State Legislature made it official, adding the phrase to the state's license plates. At that point, the myth had calcified into identity. And here's the thing about Minnesota's lakes. They are real. They are beautiful. Minnesota absolutely earns a place in any conversation about lake-rich states. The glacial history of the region genuinely did carve out tens of thousands of depressions that filled with water over millennia. But land of 10,000 lakes was never meant to be a comparative claim. It was a celebration of Minnesota's landscape, not a ranking. The problem is that Alaska, remote, cold, sparsely populated, and admitted to the Union only in 1959, never had a tourism board running the same playbook. Nobody gave Alaska a catchy slogan about its lakes. Nobody put it on a license plate. And so, for most of the 20th century, the conversation about American lakes just didn't include Alaska. Until now. To understand why Alaska has 3 million lakes, you first have to understand what Alaska actually is. Because most Americans, even those who can find it on a map, have a fairly limited mental model of the place. Alaska is 663,268 square miles. For reference, the entire state of Texas, which Americans love to describe as enormous, is about 268,000 square miles. Alaska is more than twice the size of Texas. It is larger than the next three biggest states combined. But size alone doesn't explain 3 million lakes. Lots of big places don't have 3 million lakes. The Sahara Desert is enormous. It doesn't have 3 million lakes. What makes Alaska special is a specific combination of factors, a geological and climate recipe that, when mixed together, produces lakes the way a good storm produces puddles. Everywhere, constantly. Let's break it down. The single biggest reason Alaska has more lakes than any other state on Earth, and this one surprises people, is something called permafrost. Permafrost is exactly what it sounds like: ground that is permanently frozen. Not just in winter, permanently, year-round, below a certain depth. The soil in much of Alaska has been frozen for thousands of years. In some places, it's frozen hundreds of feet deep. Now here's why that matters for lakes. In the summer, the top layer of soil, called the active layer, thaws out. Temperatures rise, snow and ice melt, rain falls. All of that water needs somewhere to go. But it can't drain, because just a few feet below the surface, the ground is as impermeable as concrete. The permafrost blocks drainage completely, so the water has nowhere to go but up. It pools on the surface, spreading into every low point, every depression, every slight dip in the landscape. And over time, those pools become lakes. These are called thermokarst lakes, one of the most visually distinctive features of Arctic and subarctic landscapes. From above, they look like someone threw a bucket of water droplets across the tundra. Thousands of perfectly round or slightly oblong lakes, covering the surface in a pattern that looks almost artificial. And because permafrost covers roughly 85% of Alaska's land area, this process plays out across the vast majority of the state. Not in pockets, not in certain regions, almost everywhere. Minnesota has no permafrost. None. Its drainage systems work the way you'd expect. Water falls, water drains. Water flows to rivers and eventually to the sea. Alaska's water, in enormous portions of the state, simply cannot escape. It stays and it becomes a lake. The second major factor is one that Minnesota and Alaska actually share, but Alaska experienced on a scale that is almost incomprehensible. During the last ice age, which peaked roughly 20,000 years ago, enormous glaciers covered vast portions of North America. These weren't small glaciers. We're talking about ice sheets miles thick, moving slowly across the landscape, grinding down mountains, carving valleys, and reshaping entire continents. When those glaciers retreated, which they did over thousands of years as temperatures gradually rose, they left behind a completely transformed landscape. They had carved deep basins in the bedrock. They had deposited enormous piles of sediment called moraines. They had blocked valleys and redirected rivers. All of those basins filled with meltwater, and that meltwater became lakes. This is the origin story of Minnesota's lakes, and it's a real one. The glaciers that moved through Minnesota left behind the depressions that are now Lake Superior, Mill Locks, Lake Minnetonka, and the thousands of smaller lakes scattered across the northern half of the state. But here's the difference. Alaska still has glaciers, more than 100,000 of them, covering about 5% of the state's land area. That makes Alaska home to the largest concentration of glaciers in the entire Western Hemisphere outside of Greenland and Antarctica. These aren't Ice Age relics. These are active, living glaciers, advancing and retreating on a yearly basis, constantly carving new basins, constantly generating meltwater, constantly creating new lakes at their edges and beneath their surfaces. While Minnesota's glacial lake-forming era ended roughly 10,000 years ago, Alaska's is still happening. Every year, Alaskan glaciers retreat slightly. Every year, the meltwater behind them pools into new basins. Every year, new lakes are born. Not as geological artifacts, but as active, ongoing products of a living landscape. The third factor is simpler, but equally important: terrain. In northern Alaska, the North Slope, the Arctic coastal plain, the landscape is extraordinarily flat. There are no dramatic valleys funneling water into rivers. There are no steep slopes directing runoff toward the sea. The land is just flat, for hundreds of miles in every direction. When water falls on flat land, whether as rain or snowmelt, it doesn't flow quickly to a river. It spreads out. It fills every low point. On flat terrain covered by permafrost, there's simply nowhere for it to go except into a lake. Compare that to a landscape with elevation. Mountains, valleys, ridges. Water that falls there has a clear path. Downhill, into streams, into rivers, to the sea. It drains efficiently. It doesn't pool. Fewer lakes form. Minnesota, while relatively flat in its northern regions, still has enough topographic variation to move water reasonably efficiently. Alaska's Arctic plains simply don't. The result is what scientists sometimes call a lake-dominated landscape, a terrain where standing water is the default state, not the exception. So let's bring it all together and look at this comparison directly. Minnesota has roughly 11,842 lakes over 10 acres. It has a glacial legacy that shaped its northern terrain over thousands of years. Its drainage systems work. Its climate is cold, but not Arctic. It has no permafrost. Alaska has 3 million lakes. It has an ongoing glacial system still carving new basins today. Its northern terrain is flat and drains poorly by design. And 85% of its land sits on permafrost that blocks water from ever leaving the surface. Alaska has approximately 250 times more lakes than Minnesota. Not 10% more, not twice as many, 250 times. And yet, we call Minnesota the land of 10,000 lakes. We teach that to school children. We print it on license plates and t-shirts and coffee mugs. To be clear, this isn't Minnesota's fault. The state's lakes are real. Its glacial history is genuine. And Land of 10,000 Lakes was never meant to be a national ranking. It was a local celebration. But the fact remains, if we're talking about which American state truly deserves the title of the Lake State, it isn't even close. So why doesn't anyone talk about this? The honest answer is accessibility. Most of Alaska's 3 million lakes have never been visited by a human being. Many of them don't have names. Many of them are accessible only by small bush plane, a mode of transport that most Americans will never use in their lives. When the Alaska Department of Fish and Game talks about the state's weather resources, they describe it in terms that feel almost mythological. Over 12,000 rivers, 3 million lakes, 6,000 miles of coastline. To fish Alaska's waters comprehensively, they say, you'd need to cast a line across 1 million acres of water every single day for a full year. This remoteness is part of what makes Alaska extraordinary. But it's also what has kept it out of the cultural conversation about lakes. You can drive to a Minnesota lake, you can rent a cabin, launch a kayak, grill burgers by the water. That's an experience that gets photographed and shared and marketed. Most of Alaska's lakes don't offer that. They're simply wild, genuinely, profoundly wild, in a way that most Americans don't have a framework for. So Minnesota's lakes become famous not just because there are many of them, but because they're accessible, woven into the daily life and identity of people who live there. Alaska's lakes exist largely in a world that human beings have barely touched. There's one more layer to this story, and it's one that's actively unfolding right now. Climate change is transforming Alaska's lake landscape in real time, and the effects are contradictory and strange. In some areas, warming temperatures are thawing permafrost in a way that creates new lakes. As the frozen ground melts and collapses, new basins form, filling with water. Satellite data shows new thermokarst lakes appearing across the Alaskan tundra in places that had solid ground just decades ago. But in other areas, the opposite is happening. As permafrost thaws deeply enough, it can open up pathways for drainage that didn't exist before. Lakes that have existed for thousands of years are suddenly draining, disappearing in a matter of days or weeks as the water finds a new path through the thawing ground. Scientists are still working to understand the net effect, whether Alaska is gaining more lakes than it's losing or the reverse. But the broader point is this: Alaska's lake landscape is not static. It's dynamic in a way that no other state's is. It's being actively reshaped by geology and climate in real time, which makes the question of how many lakes Alaska has technically a moving target. At the end of this, it's worth stepping back and asking, does it matter? Does it matter that Minnesota calls itself the land of 10,000 lakes when Alaska has 3 million? Probably not, in any practical sense. Minnesota's identity is built around its lakes in a real and meaningful way. Its people fish them, swim them, build cabins beside them, and love them. That's genuine. A nickname doesn't change any of that. But there's something worth sitting with here. The stories we tell about places, the nicknames, the slogans, the images on license plates, shape how we understand those places. And when a story gets repeated often enough, it stops being a story and starts being a fact. Minnesota is a beautiful state with thousands of genuine, gorgeous lakes. But it is not, by any reasonable measure, America's lake state. That title belongs to a place that most Americans will never visit. A vast, cold, remote wilderness in the far northwest, covered in 3 million lakes that have no names, no docks, no kayak rentals, and no tourism slogans. Just water. Millions and millions of miles of water. No sign of human presence anywhere. And that might be the most remarkable thing about it.